Everybody to the second panel, and many thanks for joining this discussion. Also, many thanks for organizing this first panel, to Luisa and to the panelists. I really enjoyed hearing this discussion, and to bring back a little bit the thoughts and then presenting our second panel. I think all three panelists made clear that, first of all, of course, macroeconomic variables matter, but also, as Professor Kahn meant, we need to radically rethink what is implementable, as he mentioned. And of course, which brings back our own project on extractivism, bringing back the role of economic rents into discussion. But also, I think the panel made clear that there are new constraints and constraints that have been not as much as visible as they are today, especially for the first generation of this developmentalist thinking. So first of all, of course, talking about climate change, the environment, but also as the panelists mentioned themselves, the world system in itself changed, right? China, India, new countries are on the rise. The role of economic rents play a crucial role today. Of course, also the major capitalist, core capitalist countries are changing. The decay of the West in a way, right? There's a big discussion going on. So are we still talking about the same global system than it has been a couple of decades before? But also after so long and intensive debates, right, about different turns in social sciences, the culturalist turn, the linguistic turn, the discursive turn, and all of this discussion, of course, discovered new actors, new social groups, and also new categories, bringing gender into discussion, bringing race into discussion, and of course, also new topics like I have already mentioned, climate change. So has that discussion and the discovery of new topics, new concepts, and new actors also challenged structuralist thought? How did it challenge? And how did it in particular change the role of how we perceive progressive action? Yeah? Who should be the relevant actor in changing this situation, and also in explaining this situation? Yeah? Who are the relevant actors we need to look at? And of course, the state was brought back into the discussion, back into discussion in a way, right? I remember the big book on bringing the state back in, right, in '84. So now, how did this also change our methodological toolkit in, first of all, discovering the questions, but also handling these different issues? And those are, I think, the relevant question for our today's generation in integrating, strengthening our explanatory power, but also relinking to this ongoing debate and bringing back in thoughts and ideas we all should have perhaps thought about before. And therefore, we invited for a very distinguished researcher for the second panel to discuss especially those questions. Thank you very much, Ingrid. Ingrid Kvangraven is actually a lecturer in international development at King's College in London. Her research is centered on the role of finance in development, structural explanations of global inequalities, and of course, the political economy of development. Also critically assessing economics as a disciplinary field. Her work contributed to a renewed interest of dependency approaches, and especially what I found pretty interesting in your publications that you has reminded us of the relevance of Sami Amin's work for the today's understanding and theorization of the broader field in political economy. Thank you for contributing to this panel. Second, I want to welcome Sara Stevano, who is actually senior lecturer in economics at SOAS at the University of London. Her area of study are the political economy of work, of food, and of inequalities, and especially of social reproduction. She is a distinguished political economist in the field of development, of course also focusing on gender and feminism. Her empirical focus is on Africa with particular experience in Mozambique and Ghana, and she is committed to expanding the boundaries of economic research, and apart from methods, particularly interested in micro-macro bridges. Welcome, Sara, to this panel. Third, also honor for me to introduce Johanna Siebert. Johanna is a project manager in the program Economic and Social Transformation at the NGO, the Berlin-based research center and NGO Das Progressive Zentrum. Her research lies in the field of global political economy and focuses on questions of socio-economic justice in the context of the social ecological crisis and social transformation. She has particularly focused on the work of Trotsky and on his theory of uneven and combined development, also made popular at the University of Sussex, where you were working on your PhD. Welcome to this panel. Finally, it's a very big honor for me also to introduce Fernando Rogitzke, who is a senior lecturer at the University of West England in Bristol. His research focuses on the political economy of development, macroeconomics, and inequalities. And he has a special focus in Latin America. He's particularly interested in the connections between economic growth, income distribution, and structural dynamics of development with an empirical focus on Brazil, using heterodox political economy, especially also in the field of post-Keynesian macroeconomics. Welcome to this panel, Fernando, and thanks you for joining our discussion. So as I mentioned, or as we mentioned before, you have prepared a short introduction, each of you a couple of minutes. I would now give Ingrid, as she was mentioned in the program, as the first name, the microphone. 10 minutes. I will make a short notice after 9 minutes and then see how your presentations work. Thank you very much for joining the discussion. Ingrid, it's your turn.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to set a timer for myself as well, so hopefully you won't have to be too strict. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. And this is a really interesting double panel. I really like the idea of having the different generations kind of coming together. I did watch some of the first panel on YouTube, but I didn't manage to catch everything, unfortunately. So thanks also for the summary that you just gave. That was great. So I spent quite a good part of my PhD reading some of the old structuralist literature. So that was when I was kind of evaluating the relevance of dependency theory, as you mentioned in when you read my bio. So I'll structure my remarks around that, and then we can talk a bit more, of course, in the discussion. So dependency theories in many ways picked up from structuralism in the 70s in Latin America, at least one strand of dependency theory. And I think that there are many strengths of that sort of body of scholarship, but also a lot of weaknesses that are important for us to think through when we think about if structuralism or how structuralism is relevant today and what we need to kind of overcome also to better understand the world and address the problems in it, especially from the perspective of the Global South. And of course, that's also important then ultimately to develop radical alternatives in this current moment. So the scholarship on dependency theory is quite a confusing field, I think, of conflicting approaches. There's lots of really excellent work and also quite like weak work, as with any topic of research where there's a wide diversity. So what I proposed after reviewing and critically analyzing all of the literature, a lot of the literature on dependency, is that it can be best understood as a research program rather than a theory. because I think this can help us identify the strengths while also addressing the weaknesses. So I later published this as an article called Beyond the Stereotype, to kind of emphasize that a lot of the time the literature is very stereotyped and strawmanned. So I'll just talk a little bit about the strengths, what I think are the key parts of the research program, and then move on to some of the weaknesses and what we need to do to kind of address them and go beyond those weaknesses, given the changes that have happened in the world economy, as I realized the last panel talked about. So the first pillar is this key concern with the production and reproduction of uneven development that's inherent to capitalism. And so this involves economic theorizing that addresses this tendency of capitalism to be polarizing. So having an economic theory there is of uneven development is a necessary aspect of the program, because without it, basically the research program is reduced to descriptions. I'll get back to this point in a second. It might seem obvious, but I think it's actually very important. It's also important to note that dependency theories that explain polarizing tendencies in the global economy don't claim that it's impossible for some countries to catch up or to develop in certain ways, but rather that it's unlikely and difficult. And since we see that between country inequality is significant for explaining high global inequality levels, as a lot of inequality scholars have found in the recent decade, so still relevant, a research program that takes these inequalities as a starting point can be very helpful and important. And then secondly, there's this strong focus on structures of production, including structures of the labor market, social relations of production, and the characteristics of the goods that are being produced and consumed in an economy, which is key for understanding global production. And many dependency theorists do draw on structuralists for this kind of analysis, but of course you also have Marxists and institutionalists, and there's debates, of course, about the role of these structures, what shapes them. And then the third pillar is this attention to the specific constraints that peripheral economies face, or developing countries, and the relationship between those constraints and these domestic and global structures. And there's lots of different constraints that are discussed in the literature, including technological dependence, terms of trade, financial constraints. And this, I think, is especially important when we're thinking about development in the periphery, development in the global south, because when we have theories that a lot of them emerge from the global north, they might not take these constraints that are particular to the periphery into account. Which is related to the final point, the final pillar, which is that dependency scholarship always takes a global historical approach to development. All dependency approaches are in one way or another critiques of this like linear historiography, from like structural analysis on the role of colonialism in shaping peripheral structures, to the neo-Marxists' attention to the extension of capitalism, how that differed across time and geographies. And many dependency scholars have gone to great lengths to document the divergence of the periphery from the center in different ways under colonialism, and the origin and persistence of structures that reinforce these inequalities. So in line with this, a core motivation of many of the Marxist dependency theorists was to challenge this like stageist view that many Marxist scholars held at the time when they were writing, that the developed nation shows the underdeveloped the image of its own future. So a lot of the neo-Marxists especially, and also the classic Marxists in the dependency program were going against modernization theory and mainstream theories, but also against sort of Eurocentric Marxism. So that's important because it's important to understand how capitalism evolved in different ways in different countries, and how colonialism and imperialism has shaped the possibilities for capitalist development across the world in uneven ways. So I think there's a lot to learn from this rich body of scholarship, and those four pillars are some key strengths that we can bring forward. But of course, we don't want to kind of take theories and concepts from the past and apply them dogmatically. So I think it's also important to address the problems and weaknesses, especially for this new generation, which apparently we're being called. So there are four main points that I'd like to bring up in that regard as well. which is on theory, as I kind of mentioned a little bit already, and the role of agency, which was one of the questions that the organizers sent to us before, the unit of analysis, and especially the role of the nation state as such a unit, as I understood was also a discussion in the earlier panel. And then finally, intersectionality. So in terms of theorization, I think it's important to address this if we want to push a dependency research program forward, because a lot of dependency theory actually was quite descriptive and tended to describe symptoms of dependency without kind of rigorously theorizing the mechanism. Especially some of the, like Andre Gunder Frank is like a classic example of that. And there are a lot of very good critiques within the dependency theory, dependency research program of that as well. So then it's not really enough to just talk about dependency as a condition or a situation, which is why I mentioned this first pillar in the beginning about theorizing the uneven dynamics being very important. So yeah, this is something that we need to be careful about. And the second critique or weakness that I wanted to bring up is the mechanic nature of some of dependency theory, in particular some of the neo-Marxist strands, which could leave not that much room for agency. So again, this addresses one of the questions from the organizers, which is about like the role of the different roles between agency and structure and the relative importance of both. And it was a very important question within the dependency debate as well at the time, and it still is, which also links to this question about the relationship between internal and external processes. So of course, like uneven development can't be explained only by studying local level individual agents. But theory can also move to the other extreme and only look at like structural superdeterminism, which doesn't account for any variations in agency within. So that being said, the claim that dependency scholars describe the dynamics of international capitalism in a way that leaves little room for the state and social groups, I think is a bit simplistic if it's meant to be a general critique, because it's only applicable to some parts of dependency theory, and to a large extent, it was directed to world systems theory. And I would say that dependency theorists place the relationship between the internal and external at the center, their analysis. And Andre Gunder Frank, again, was kind of the straw man that was consumed in the global north, who does actually neglect agency in some of his work. So I guess, yeah, the core insight to retain from dependency theory is that, yeah, internal dynamics must be examined through also considering the relationship to the global economy. So taking the structure of the global economy as a starting point was important for them, but this didn't necessarily mean that they would only think in terms of core periphery or that they would think deterministically. So that's another point where we need to be careful when we go forward. And now I'm noticing that I'm at time. I still have another 2 things to say. So I'll try to speed up. Sorry about that, Hannes. So the third weakness was the question of the unit of analysis. And that basically, yeah, key theoretical and methodological question, which is linked to this like question of the nation. And many dependency theorists did analyze how the nation state is subordinate in a global hierarchy, which had implications for national level analysis about like balance of payments constraints, trade imbalance, competitiveness, technological capabilities, etc. And so because of this, it's been critiqued for being kind of putting forward a methodologically nationalist method. Whereas actually there's like a lot of variety within dependency theory, that a lot of scholars do look at domestic units of analysis or even like global units like the global working class. So to what extent the national level is a helpful unit of analysis to grapple is something that we need to grapple with. And it's an old question. It goes back to like the debates between Marx and List, or Marx's critique of List, Frederick List, which Eric Reinert couldn't join in the previous panel, but I'm sure he would have talked about List if he was there. Of course, it's also a discussion that was very lively as developing countries are becoming independent, when a lot of scholars were then challenging the global system and engaging in what Getachew calls world making and really trying to change the global system. But then a lot of the time they were limited to actually, like in terms of policy, to implementing national policies. So there's like a tension there, which is also something that we need to think about when we think about like what alternative policies should we push for, and how does our unit of analysis shape what we can see and what we can't see, and what kind of possibilities we can push for. And finally, and I won't talk much about this, I'm sure Sara will talk more about it, but the intersectional analysis and dependency analysis was quite weak at the time. There was a very strong emphasis on class rather than race or gender. But there is like work within the new generation of dependency scholars that does look at, for example, Sophia Edwards combines Black radical tradition with dependency to try to understand how the global economy is also racialized. And there's some work by Felipe de Antunes Oliveira, who brings identity into dependency theory as well. I wonder if I should leave it there, Hannes, or do you want me to, because there was one more question that organizers posed to us about the wave of pessimism and populism and nationalism that I could talk about. But maybe
because of time issues, we can leave it here, yeah. And but we can ask this or discuss the question in the discussion later.
Yeah.
So, Sara, it's your turn.
Thank you so much, Hannes. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel, and I listened with a lot of interest also the conversations in the previous panel. So there is some crossover with some of the points that Ingrid raised in what I'm going to say, but I'm going to get to them through a different trajectory. And what I will do is I will take you on a little journey to Mozambique, which is a country that I worked on and off since 2010. And the reason why I want to do this is because I think it's very important to ground some more general reflections in context-specific analysis, bringing in also some micro elements, which links to the discussion one of the themes that were discussed in the previous panel. But also, I think Mozambique is a very useful context to think about, because it provides a perspective from the periphery of the periphery, which I think is very much neglected in much of economic theory. And instead, I think these perspectives are fundamental in order to understand global economic issues. So what I'm going to try to do is to sketch a very brief picture of the organization of production and social reproduction in contemporary Mozambique, and then link it at the end with a few brief reflections that link back to some of the questions that were put to us by the organizers. So I think a good starting point to talk about Mozambique is to define that country as being historically part of the macro region that was defined by Samir Amin as the Africa of the labor reserves, which means essentially that part of the African continent where labor extraction was a key means of colonial domination, and labor extraction was primarily aimed at ensuring a cheap supply of labor to the mines in South Africa. And at the same time, also various forms of forced labor were used to produce export crops such as cotton for the colonizing country, which in the case of Mozambique was Portugal. And so these colonial labor regimes created a number of very significant implications for the gendered organization of production and reproduction at the household level. And some of these implications are still very visible today, and therefore they're not only important from a historical perspective. Now, after the colonial time, Mozambique had a brief socialist period, which was led by Frelimo, the socialist movement that had led the war for independence and won it. But yes, so this period was quite short-lived, and then the country in the 1990s was thrown into a very deep crisis due to a civil war. And, at that point, towards the end of the 1990s, the levels of poverty in the country were above, almost reaching 90%, essentially. And after this period, Mozambique embraced the neoliberal turn and became known among mainstream development thinkers and practitioners as a success story. Between 2000 and 2015, at the same time as many other countries in the continent experienced a high economic growth driven primarily by commodity prices, Mozambique too had an annual GDP growth above 6% for that period of 15 years and became one of the most attractive economies for foreign direct investment, FDI, particularly in natural resources. So I should also say that Mozambique today remains a low-income country with levels of poverty above 60%. So you can see how that period of growth did not translate into benefits and gains shared by the majority of the population. And in the past few years has been facing a debt and an ecological crisis, as well as an armed insurgency in the north of the country. So things are not looking good. And indeed, the people who study Mozambique are now questioning very robustly that the story of Mozambique is a success story, essentially. But if we want to look at the key features of the contemporary political economy of Mozambique, I would refer here to the work by Carlos Nuno Castelbranco, who is a Mozambican economist, who points to three key features of the contemporary political economy of the country. The first one is the maximization of FDI, where FDI are a key channel through which the Mozambican economy is essentially extractive in nature. And this includes very concerning elements of what can be called as enclave extractivism that underlie the armed insurgency in the north of the country since 2017. The second element is the development of linkages between foreign capital inflows and domestic capital accumulation, where the emerging capitalist classes seek to appropriate the surplus generated by the mega projects, so investments in natural resources essentially. And the third element is the reproduction of a labor regime that remunerates workers below the cost of social reproduction and maintains a larger part of the population as in permanent conditions of being surplus labor, essentially. So my research addresses primarily this last point that has to do with social reproduction and labor. And it focuses on the mechanism that make it possible to systematically remunerate workers below the cost of social reproduction, and also analyzing how the squeeze of social reproduction can reach points of crisis where then that crisis feeds back into the productive structure and the general functioning of the economy. So the argument that I'm making here is that without a perspective on the structural conditions for social reproduction, it is not possible to gain a full understanding of the organization of production. And for the poor classes in the periphery of the periphery, social reproduction is not subordinate or residual to production, but in fact almost the opposite can be argued, I think. So in localized labor markets and in export-oriented industries alike, workers are compelled to engage in a combination of reproductive and productive work, including a variety of forms of wage and self-employment, farm and non-farm work. And this is all needed to meet the needs of an increasingly commodified life, and also in response to the fragmentation of labor markets into essentially jobs that do not ensure earnings that are sufficient to make a living. So this is the fragmented reality of the so-called classes of labor in the periphery of the periphery. And the ability of classes of labor to meet their social reproduction needs is further complicated by a number of things that I think are best observed at the micro level. So I would like to mention four such elements that are very relevant for the Mozambican context, of course. So the first is the necessity to be mobile. So a lot of jobs and forms of cash earning activities or petty commodity trading and production require people to move around. And the necessity for mobility is compounded by very poor transport and road infrastructure. A second element has to do with the spatial reorganization of life, linked, for instance, to recent and ongoing processes of urbanization, where social reproduction remains fundamentally family-centered, but extended families now live across different places, including sometimes across national borders. The third element has to do with the specific temporal dynamics where the organization of work and life is dictated by particular everyday dynamics and seasonal ones, so that are particularly important, particularly where agriculture is rain-fed. And the fourth and final element that I would like to mention here is the tension between the ongoing need that people have to participate in ceremonies, so which I think is very important for the reproduction of the so-called social, okay? It ensures a social membership and access to social mechanisms of support, and the lack of recognition of such necessity in more formal, if you can call them like that, so workplaces, where it's very difficult for workers to get time off in order to participate in this, to meet their social obligations. So all of these dynamics are fundamentally structured by class. They are profoundly gendered. Ethnicity also matters a lot in the Mozambican context, as well as migration status. And this is to name, I think, the main axes of power that are relevant in this context. Overall, this means that we see a picture of increasing fragmentation of the means of social reproduction in peripheral economies with narrow and extractive productive structures, where labor, including surplus labor, is essentially trapped in what I call various forms of precarious and exploitative dynamism. And the conditions of both exploitation and survival rest on essentially the perpetuation of such precarious dynamism. So social reproduction in the periphery of the periphery is essentially in a chronic condition of crisis, I'm almost done, with likely detrimental effects on labor and labor productivity. It also contributes to the reproduction of inequalities, and it impinges on foreign capital volatility for implications for domestic capital accumulation and the formation of a domestic capitalist class. So just to conclude very briefly, I would like to link this to three very brief considerations that link back to the broader questions you had put to us. So the first is that as I think it's fundamental that we recenter core periphery relations as well as structures of production in contemporary economics or development economics, it is also essential to foreground social reproduction. And that means analyzing not only what underlies production, but also what fundamentally shapes it in peripheral contexts. The second point that I would like to make is that a social reproduction approach offers a very useful lens to capture multiple and intersecting forms of inequality that are reproduced through the organization of production and reproduction. And I think that this is an area where a lot more work needs to happen, how to develop a solid understanding of gender and race in development economics that does not replace a class, but alongside a class as a fundamental axis of power. And this links also to that consideration or the debate on structure versus agency, where I think that social reproduction offers a lens to think about the agency of individuals to shape their everyday life, but linking it back to structural conditions. And finally, to address the question on methods that are needed, I think that this complex kind of structuralist analysis requires a mixed method approach grounded in primary data collection, and also to counter the need to be experts on technical issues that can be applied across the board. I think that we need to try to revalue long-term engagement with specific contexts. Sorry it took a bit longer, and thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Fernando, it's your turn.
Okay. Let me just organize here. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in these events, and it has been a pleasure to listen both to the presentations in the first panel and now to the presentations, the first few presentations in this one. I'd like to use my 10 minutes here in the following way. I think that the emphasis of the event in its as a whole in this wave of pessimism is interesting because from the standpoint of Latin America, where I come from and which is the focus of my study, there is a lot of parallels between this current wave of pessimism and a previous one that took place in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think that my argument is that the previous wave of pessimism from the 1960s and 1970s led to a significant intellectual development. Of course, led to a lot of social, political suffering and a lot of violence, but it led to very important intellectual developments that part of them could still be very much fruitful for us to engage with the understanding of contemporary capitalist economies. So I'm thinking here about what Albert Hirschman called political disasters that took place mainly in Latin America in the 1960s and 1970s, the series of military dictatorships that spread across the region and the civil wars that broke out in this period that led to a very significant change in the course of development thinking. So the so-called pioneers of economic development or classical development thinkers were forced to revisit their previous formulations and revisit their previous optimist approaches to development to try to incorporate and understand what had gone wrong and why their hopeful expectations for the course of industrialization and development policies ended up in such political dismal crisis. A lot of them, of course, a lot of the early development thinkers were themselves exiled by these political disasters and fled to the global north to start to rethink what went wrong. And there are, of course, several strands of this revision that were very relevant. It is the moment, of course, where there is a very fruitful interaction between early development thinking and Marxism, for example. There is, of course, the development of dependency theory that Ingrid already mentioned. But the particularly strand of revision which I'm more interested in, and I think it's very fruitful, is the development of what would be called later by Aníbal Pinto, the Chilean economist, styles of development. So that came from a formulation by Celso Furtado, the great Brazilian economist, which was trying to engage himself with classical development thinking and the kind of smooth, hopeful idea that there would be a transition of labor from so-called subsistence sectors to capitalist sectors, something that was very much that was very influential through the work of Arthur Lewis. This hopeful idea of this smooth transition from subsistence to capitalist sectors would be the key evidence of development in itself. And Furtado was trying to engage with this model and add layers of complexity to it, and came up with the idea that we should think about the structures of demand and the structures of supply as interacting with one another in a cumulative way. So he called the structures of demand mainly income distribution and the patterns of consumption, and the structures of supply would be the sectoral compositions of output and employment. In his stake in the mid-1960s, so just after the military coup in Brazil, he was thinking about this cumulative process in a way which led in the particular circumstances that were observed in Brazil at the time, that led to stagnationism. So he thought that a specific concentrated income distribution led to a particular pattern of consumption, an aggregate average pattern of consumption, which pushed output and employment compositions in a specific direction, which tended to reinforce stagnationist tendencies in the Brazilian economy. So we would not grow because of income distribution that was too concentrated. He was of course proved very wrong, because Brazil, just after the military coup, went into one of the most prosperous periods of its history, with very high growth of rates, the so-called Brazilian economic miracle. Very, very violent politically, very concentrated, very unequalizing growth, but prosperous nonetheless. So what happened is that a lot of authors started criticizing Furtado's approach, but Maria da Conceição Tavares was one of the most prominent of those economists that were criticizing him. But all of them, and later on Aníbal Pinto, the Chilean economist I already mentioned, they all criticized Furtado, but they kind of adopted his method. So the idea of a cumulative process between the structure of demand and the structure of supply was kind of accepted by his critics. It was separated from his claim of stagnationism, and survived as, in my view, a very fruitful way about thinking in an integrated and coherent way about the patterns of accumulation, the way that shapes income distribution and is shaped by income distribution, the way that changes through the changes in the sectoral composition of employment. It changes the structure of the labor market and the structure of social classes in this peripheral context. So this idea of this cumulative process between the structure of demand and structure of supply, this idea of a style of development, seems to me something that comes out from this debate of the 1960s and 1970s, a very interesting, fruitful way to think about current peripheral economies in a way that allows us to bring together not only the sectoral dynamics, which seems to be crucial to inequality dynamics in contemporary economies, but also the political economy of development in this context, as it links the pattern of accumulation to changing class structures and to different forms of class struggle. So the way we've been trying to use this approach is thinking about the experience of the pink tide in South America, not only in Brazil, but also in its neighbors. So for some time, this pink tide South American countries were kind of considered a hopeful experience of combining development and inequality reduction, of trying to show a way for inclusive development. But in hindsight, it is clear that it had several weaknesses, and these weaknesses can be read through this concept of styles of development as related to the fact that inequality reduction in this particular context was very much premised on structural regression in terms of the changing compositions of output and employment. So if you look at the case of Brazil, for example, what happened is that you have, if we start from the policies, for example, we have very important redistributive policies like increasing minimum wages or the income transfer policies that had an impact in reducing wage inequality. This fall in wage inequality did change consumption patterns overall, so you see a very important change, diversification of consumption patterns, especially by the poorer groups of the population, beyond basic necessities towards basic services and some durable goods. This change in consumption patterns affects output and employment composition, but in a way that basically pushes the economy towards low productivity, low wage sectors, and most of the durable goods consumption is being met by imported goods from especially from East Asia, especially from China, right? But this change in the composition of employment was very significant for further reducing wage inequality. It created a lot of low-paying jobs, but low-paying jobs that in this context specifically are kind of in the middle of the income distribution, and they are precariously formalized. So it was specifically this structural regression, this reduction in the share of, say, high-paying manufacturing jobs, high-paying jobs in knowledge-intensive services and so on and so forth. And this creation of these huge amounts of precarious formalization in basic services and in the construction industry that allowed for a further reduction in wage inequality that fed into the process further. So further reduction in wage inequality shifted further patterns of consumption and so on and so forth. So you had this cumulative process in which structural regression and falling wage inequality reinforced each other, but it was of course very limited because it allowed for a very substantial change in wage inequality in Brazil, in Argentina and some of its neighbors. It allowed for a very substantial process of formalization of work, even though very precarious. But at the same time that it made these economies much more vulnerable to balance of payments constraint, much more vulnerable to shifts in the prices of commodities, and so on and so forth. So given that I'm running out of time, what I think what I would like to say just to finish is that in the 1970s, Furtado went back to his early stagnationist model to suggest that economic development should be thought as a myth, because even high rates of growth just reinforced inequality and made underdevelopment more acute instead of less acute. So we were in a period in which a lot of the hopeful expectations about development were being shattered, and scholars turned towards pessimism at the same time as they were developing very powerful tools to understand the reasons for this pessimism and the reason why the political economy of development made actual development, actual inclusive development, and the actual overcoming of underdevelopment very, very difficult. 40 years afterwards, I think we are in a similar position. Even the hopeful experience of the pink tide countries in South America seem, in hindsight, to have been very limited. It's very, in my view, useful to understand these particular experiences using the same tools that were developed in the 1970s, if they are expanded, of course, to include a lot of different concepts and ideas that were developed later on, but it gives us a similar conclusion. Even an experience that was able to reduce inequality and to change, at least for a time, the fragmentation of the structure of the labor market in peripheral economies was plagued by a lot of weaknesses and limitations that ended up contributing to its demise, and the reversion of these trends in terms of inequality, formalization, and so on and so forth was impressively quick as the pink tide governments were defeated and the right rose to power again. I would have a lot of more to say about how we should try to make this idea of styles of development applicable to contemporary capitalist economies, but I think we can go back to that in the discussion later on. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Fernando. So going further to Johanna's talk.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you and Louisa for organizing this really interesting set of talks, and for inviting me to participate today. Thanks also for the introduction, but just for the record, I don't have a PhD yet. I've completed my MA at Sussex in 2020, and I'm currently planning my future PhD project. But as you said, I'm particularly interested in the socio-ecological crisis and how Marx's thought can help us to make sense of it. And today I want to talk about climate change and the theory of uneven and combined development, which is usually abbreviated as UCD. And so I think that climate change has profoundly challenged our way of understanding the world. So in his new book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, some of you might know it, the post-colonial historian Dipesh Chakrabarty formulated the challenge that is at hand, because the climate crisis, he says, forces us to, and I quote him here, bring together intellectual formations that are somewhat in tension with each other. And what he means is that on the one hand, we need to come to terms with our collective identity as a species, a humanity that is part of and dependent on a planetary ecosystem which has now come under threat by climate change, because essentially without a biophysical history, climate change would simply have no meaning to us. But also on the other hand, our analysis must be attentive to the divided humanity of recent history. This is a humanity that is characterized by inequality, by exploitation and oppression. And it is one that has been shaped by and through the histories of capitalism and imperialism. And these inequalities are, of course, essential to understanding the differentiated responsibility for climate change and its unequal impacts. But how can we actually make sense of our simultaneously universal and particular identity? And I think that the theory of UCD might be able to help us here. So I'll say a couple of words about the theory itself and the context in which it was designed. And then I want to focus on the ways in which UCD can help us to mediate three false dichotomies, namely that of the social and the intersocietal, that of agency and structure, and that of the particular and the universal. And I think it's this bringing together of seemingly contradictory dimensions of human life that makes the theory so useful in studying the climate crisis. So I'm sure most of you know that UCD was first developed by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky in the early 20th century. And he originally set out to solve a puzzle, namely why the socialist revolution began in Russia, a place that really did not look like it followed Marxist linear theory of capitalist development and socialist transition. And capitalist globalization, Trotsky observed, reached different countries at different points in time. And the spatial and also temporal unevenness produced geopolitical pressures that, as well as opportunities that Marx himself and classical social theory had neglected. And Trotsky called them the whiff of external necessity and the privilege of historic backwardness. So what he meant is really well explained in relation to Russia at the time. So faced with geopolitical competition as a consequence of the rise of capitalism in Western Europe, Tsarist Russia was compelled to initiate top-down industrialization, while as a latecomer it enjoyed kind of the privilege of being able to import and perfect foreign technology, knowledge, and also social structures. And this gave rise to what Trotsky then called combined development, where internal and external elements get mixed up and adapted inside individual societies, which then enables the skipping of what classical social theory had referred to as stages of development. And in the case of Russia, this meant rapid industrialization imposed by a Tsarist regime onto a largely agrarian society. And for Trotsky, this helped to explain why the socialist revolution looked so different from what classical Marxism had expected. But I don't actually want to talk about the Russian Revolution, but I think it illustrates really well that by bringing in the international or the intersocietal dimension into his analysis, Trotsky could explain a social development that classical Marxist theory could not. And this produced a distinctly non-linear and also dialectical theory of global capitalism. And of course, it's not surprising then that Marxists across the world and contemporary Marxists have, particularly in the field of international relations, used the theory of UCD to challenge reductionist, Eurocentric and internalist interpretations of capitalism. And UCD has been reworked into a social theory of the international. It has been applied multiple times as an empirical method, and it has been used to analyze a range of developments from the rise of capitalism to Iranian state formation to the First World War, Brexit, and so many more. But at the beginning of this presentation, I said that UCD is able to bridge the three false dichotomies, and that this would help us make sense of the climate crisis. And I think it makes sense to take each of them in turn. So first of all, UCD asserts that the social and the intersocietal dimension of human life are inseparable, because social developments within particular societies cannot be understood in abstraction from the wider intersocietal context in which they take place. And so that means that geopolitical and geoeconomic pressures or opportunities shape if, how, and when social changes are implemented by historical actors. And of course, by itself, that doesn't actually tell us so much about the climate crisis. But Trotsky actually located this unevenness in the ecological unevenness of nature. And not only is the biosphere itself a source of unevenness, it is also characterized by interconnectedness, right? This has become very evident in the context of the climate crisis. And so from a historical materialist perspective, it follows that the content of societal multiplicity is not purely social, but it's actually socio-ecological. So that means coexisting societies present multiple ways of organizing our collective interaction with nature. So consider, for example, the unique ways in which production and distribution is actually organized in oil exporting states and how they differ from each other. And so if we recognize the socio-ecological unevenness, we of course see that climate change affects countries unequally, right? And this presents an obstacle to global climate action because not all countries have the same imperative or capacity to act. But we also see how socio-ecological unevenness actually allows for the outsourcing of environmentally harmful activities to countries with lower environmental or labor standards, and how this aggravates inequalities rather than promoting genuine climate action. An example could be, for example, the mining of rare minerals that are needed to build electric cars, or carbon offsetting schemes, for example, in the global south. And on the second question, on the question of agency and structure, which we are given by the organizers, here UCD follows Marx's famous dictum that men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. So moving beyond that dichotomy, UCD situates creative agency in the context of historically grown and inherited structures. And so intersocietal unevenness provides essentially the context in which combination takes place, and combination is takes place through human agency. And this in turn creates further unevenness, and that provides the context for future historical actors in which they operate. And so in relation to the climate crisis, this ability to navigate between agency and structure is really relevant, because how else would we be able to recognize climate change as an unintended outcome of a myriad of social actions, and at the same time acknowledge the delimiting structure it constitutes for present and also future historical agents, right? And so finally, I think that by transcending these first two dichotomies, UCD also allows us to bridge the divide between the particular and the universal that was at the beginning, that I introduced at the beginning in reference to Chakrabarty's work, because it incorporates unevenness and combination into the very core of historical materialism. And this essentially means that social development in general is conceptualized as particular, as contingent, and as interactive. And so the outcome of developmental processes is never predetermined, and it cannot be known except through historical study. But at the same time, the universal lies in UCD's assertion that human life depends on productive interaction with nature and has therefore always been multiple and interactive. And so contrary to classical social theory, UCD can offer a heterogeneous notion of the universal that does not negate but actually sustains the particular. And so this allows us to integrate the modern history of a divided humanity shaped by industrial capitalism and colonialism, where the responsibility for and actually the impacts of climate change are highly unequal, into a more long-term species history of a humanity that has come to disrupt biophysical processes on a planetary scale. And yeah, so to conclude on a positive note, maybe, perhaps it is the same simultaneous recognition of the universal and the particular, which allows us to construct a sort of transnational narrative for solidarity in the context of climate action, while still situating kind of cultural variation and difference in the context of some ecological totality. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Thank you very much for all of your talks. Very fascinating talks, and I think all of your talks show very interestingly that we are no longer able to think of, in a way, of a linear world, right? As it was proposed for so long time, especially in a more or less neoliberal worldview perspective, right? So going from A to B in a more or less in a clear-cut process without any conflicts. And as Fernando put it, to think more about cumulative processes, right? That also creates a certain ambiguity, right? Because the thinking is oscillating, and this oscillation, in a way, I discovered in all of your talks. And this is also interesting, but at the same time, it creates questions, right? Ingrid, one of those questions is, as you mentioned, the dependency framework, yeah, the perspective rather than the theory, from the very beginning was quite critical in just focusing on one scale, right? But rather connecting different scales, the internal, the external, the international with the local. However, if we think of the actual situation today, it rather appears that it might turn out to be a strengthening of the national scale, right? The COVID crisis, to mention, but also the war in Ukraine, right? And especially the remilitarization of Europe that we can experience today seems to be one point in also a larger thinking. How that turns out to be a relevant point in that thinking. Do we need to think again about the superiority of different scales? That means the strengthening of the state, or rather the how to reconnect then statehood with the international and the local within that framework.
Thank you so much. That's a really, really good question. And I think, I guess, I mean, yeah, well, dependency theory is interesting, or dependency theories are interesting because they do connect the theorization with the politics in a very kind of clear way that social scientists today aren't always as politically activist, like in the moment, like as Fernando mentioned in the 60s, that was actually when a lot of intellectual very innovative thinking was happening because of the political context. And I think your question kind of touches on that, because I think in dependency theory, or the framework, or the way I talked about it, it's about connecting the scales. But it doesn't necessarily tell us, like the theory doesn't necessarily tell us where we need to put our emphasis politically. But I think the theory can help us maybe understand this rising nationalism that you mentioned here, where the national aspect is becoming very strong. Because, and I think this is also something that I didn't get to mention, but about that has to do with how the research program of dependency, and I think actually several of you mentioned it, that it's not just about the economic, but it's about there's a lot of like the political and the social and the historical aspect. It's also really important to understand what's going on and to understand the economic processes as well, because they're not just about economics. So I think in order to understand the current moment where there is a rise of nationalism, we need to understand sort of how we got there and the socioeconomic processes behind that, and decades of austerity and what that did to people. And this is sort of nationalism that came out of it. That doesn't mean, I think the fact that people are turning to nationalism, I don't think is necessarily, doesn't necessarily mean that the solutions lie at the national scale from like a, from a scholarly level or from a political left perspective. I think actually it's kind of the failure of any kind of global project that challenged the problems that the dependency theorists saw, and structuralists and Trotskyites and feminists, I guess. Lots of people on the left saw these problems that were very global and that I think are very difficult to tackle at the national level. But in the absence of a global movement that could challenge the systemic problems, I think this nationalism has kind of arisen as the way to deal with these issues. I think in some instances, nationalism can make sense, not in terms of like identity, in the identity sense, but in the sense of like the national questions that a lot of anti-colonial Marxists saw when they were part of the global unequal structure and they needed to take over control of their national economies and like break from the colonial legacies and stuff. That in a way has a national aspect to that project, but it was about also challenging that structure itself. I think nationalism today isn't that kind of nationalism. It's a bit more about keeping people out and just trying to focus on certain identity groups. And I think that's not the way that we can kind of create a better world for everyone, or challenge the structures that suppress marginalized groups. So in that sense, I actually think that the rise of nationalism, in a way, paradoxically, shows the need for more structural global approaches that look at the system as a global system with problems that can't be fully solved at the national level. Yeah, that would be my take on that.
Thank you very much. So bringing Frans Fanon back into discussion in a way, right, from the dependency part. Sara, I also discovered this kind of oscillating thought in your talk, right? Especially when it comes to the perspective of social reproduction. It seems to me that you have been describing a certain very stable situation in Mozambique, right? Where, of course, actually there is a lot of struggles going on, but at the same time, at the macro level, it seems to be quite stable. So is there any linkage between the chaotic situation at the micro level and a very stable situation at the macro level? And how does social reproduction fits into this, if I got your thoughts right?
Thank you, Johannes. I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with the characterization that macroeconomic conditions have been stable throughout, and that contrasts with the messiness of micro-level dynamics. I think what I would say is that there are some important elements of continuity between the colonial time and the post-colonial development trajectories that are visible in the country at multiple scales, actually, not only at the macro one, but also at the micro level. But I think that you are indeed pointing to one key concern from my perspective, which I think is particularly relevant for economists, because I do think that these connections between what happens at the micro level and what happens at the macro level are not well theorized, and we have very little conceptual and methodological guidance on how to establish those vertical links, if you want. And so in a way, there is either a tendency to dismiss what happens at the micro level and focus on the macro, or, on the other hand, there is this very reductionist approach that I think is very widespread in mainstream economics in particular, which is to explain micro phenomena through micro explanations. And I think that there's a fundamental problem there, right? So I cannot absolutely claim that I achieved any of, I achieved that process of bridging micro-macro gaps in my work. But this is in a way my research agenda, and I think it is where further work needs to be done. And my approach has been to start with understanding exactly the complexities, but also the regularities of micro-level dynamics, and then seeking to link them back to historical macro processes of change. And one thing that I want to add is that I think this is absolutely necessary from the perspective of understanding inequalities or forms of oppression and exploitation along lines of class, gender, and race. I mean, there is absolutely no way that we can understand the gender dynamics only through a global perspective, right? And so we need to understand how these inequalities occur at multiple levels. And in this sense, I also have a lot of sympathy with what Johanna was saying in terms of, really understanding how what we're talking about here is not only, economic, because what is economic in isolation from social, political, and cultural factors? And so that requires, I think, a very complex kind of engagement at multiple scales. And I do think, so this is where I'm trying to focus my work, and this is all very much work in progress, but I do have the sense that a social reproduction lens can offer a useful analytical framework in order to connect some of these processes at multiple scales and also across what we still think of in sort of separate or disciplinary ways. Yeah, and I think I can stop here for now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Also to you, Fernando, I think you have been, or in your talk, you mentioned explicitly the cumulative process, right? That is also very distinct to or neoclassical economics, right? That have a very, very positivist view on causation and causality. I was wondering that kind of bringing in this multiple equilibrium thought into discussion, and also in your case, the problem of the structure of the world economy, also micro-macro in a way, if we think about the macro structure of the world economy. And the question would be then that the solutions pretty much put forward of the heterodox generation, as Professor Hartmut Elsenhans or Professor Bressa-Pereira put into discussion, devaluation-driven development policies in today's structure won't function properly because of, as you have mentioned, China is actually exporting at cheaper rates, right? So where is the political room for maneuver, if I got your things right, to engage with this kind of policies today? So how to connect again micro and macro, and how to create development policies that are not running into this kind of suboptimal underdevelopment traps in a way.
Thank you, Hannes, for the interesting question. Can I just say a couple of words about the questions for my colleagues as well, so that we can engage in some debate? Just a minute. So the issue of the return of the state or the national level, I think it's interesting. I agree with Ingrid's reply, and I think there's two levels of analysis here, right? In one sense, I think that the the best examples of dependency theory would be able to contribute a lot to our current understanding of the resurgence of nationalism, both as a way, through the way in which they integrate, as she mentioned before, internal and external processes, and how the relationship, especially between domestic ruling classes in peripheral contexts to the global economy, to global capitalism, in say a couple of decades ago, led to the worldwide expansion of free trade and neoliberal policies, and then afterwards it led to a crisis of this huge organic crisis in which we are at, that allowed for the reemergence of nationalism. So from the standpoint of analysis, or for the standpoint of interpretation, I think that connecting internal and external processes is still a very much valid way to understand the resurgence of nationalism. From the standpoint of, say, from a normative standpoint, I also agree with Ingrid in the following sense. I think that the resurgence of nationalism has mostly been focused on trying to re-legitimate capitalist social relations through authoritarianism policies. So resurgence of nationalism do question neoliberal hegemony, but from the right, not from, say, a perspective that would open the way to emancipation. But of course, I think there is, I would say that more, say, more forcefully a couple of years ago. I'm a bit more pessimistic now, but I think there is an opening when the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism is questioned. There is an opening for the countries of the global South to expand policy space to reimagine development for a long time, and that relates to the question you addressed to me directly. For a long time, we've been thinking about development in terms of catching up to income per capita levels of the global North, and I do not think that that's completely illegitimate. A lot of the solutions for the very serious problems of the global South do require, say, higher levels of income. But for a long time, we've been thinking, say, too narrowly development along those lines, and the routes opened for this kind of development by the global capitalist economy has been mostly meant low wages and extractive economic activities. So those routes to development are not conducive to any kind of actual development, inclusive development, to the actual emancipation of the great majorities of the global South. So Furtado's answer in the 1970s to this reality, to what he called the myth of economic development, was his challenge for us to actually try to reimagine development from the standpoint of the great majorities of the global South, reimagine development from the standpoint of the periphery, and I do think that the shattering of the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism opened a little bit of space for this reimagination, but mostly this opening has been captured by the far right or by the conventional right that has been fueling the resurgence of the state with just xenophobic nationalist policies that are not conducive at all to any reimagination of development. And just, I think I already said to me, just a last point. On social reproduction, I'm very sympathetic to the framework that Sara has been talking about. And from our own analysis on Brazil, it's very interesting. It connects very much to what we've been doing because one of the processes that did take place in the last couple of decades in Brazil that has seldom been noticed is a very substantial transformation of social relations of production in agriculture in Brazil. Brazil is considered this like middle income industrialized country, but it still had in the early 2000s, almost a fifth of its population in agricultural activities, and the most of this population working in agriculture was peasant economies, mostly, not wage workers in capitalist agriculture. And this got very significantly transformed. So we had some sort of semi-proletarianization characterizing peasant economies in Brazil at this moment, and this was transformed very significantly. And this, of course, entailed a profound change in social reproduction of significant swaths of Brazilian population, with in a micro level in this specific, say, rural context, but with very significant macro implications. If you look at the trajectory of, say, average wages, the trajectory of class struggle in general, and labor militancy in Brazil in this last 2 decades, I don't think we can explain it and understand it if we don't look at these changes at the social reproduction level and these changes in social relations of production in agriculture, which still was very crucial for a very significant part of the Brazilian economy. And last, on the valuation, I think Professor Bresser and a lot of other economists have been making a very important point that one of the, say, weaknesses of the experience of the pink tide governments in South America was that they used effectively the appreciation, the currency appreciation that came with the commodities boom and the abundant liquidity of the early 2000s as a way to keep inflation slow and to compensate for increasing minimum wages, increasing wages in service activities, and so on and so forth, at the same time that average inflation was kept somewhat low. But they underestimated the impact of this appreciated currency on fueling the structural regression of the economy in terms of shifting employment and output towards low productivity activities. But again, I agree with you that I think that we need, in the current context, to think about development in a way that has to move beyond the routes to development opened by global capitalism and simply devaluing our currency in order to have access to global markets seems to be a strategy that would, in the current context, not be sufficient, to say the least.
Thank you very much. So it's a very, very, very good link to Johanna's talk, because thinking more complex also means thinking about uneven and combined development, because it's actually making things complex, right? As you mentioned on your 3 levels, it links social and societal levels. It links structure and agency, but also the particular with the universal. However, and this is my question, does it not become neutral to social change then? Who are the actors that should push for and are pushing for social change in that framework? And how does that relate to both Trotsky's idea and what is the new thing about that?
Yeah, so I think that the idea about UCD is that it doesn't work on its own, right? It's more of a kind of a device that guides our historical analysis, but it's still dependent on kind of a mid-range theory such as historical materialism that would then allow us to analyze social change at the kind of local level. But it and here again, yes, also of course kind of conflicts and class conflicts around production, reproduction as well, and distribution are essential here. But I think what it adds essentially to the historical materialist perspective is that these actors within states and so the classes within countries find themselves not only in the context of their own country and the social relations of their own country, but they are also confronted in the current world system, right, with the presence of other societies. And this creates certain pressures, for example, for also not only economic reproduction, but also in a geopolitical environment, right, the states. So especially in the context of, so that example that that Trotsky used, or the analysis of Russia, for example, where he was analyzing how the Russian regime was threatened geopolitically, and that then led them to implement social changes internally, right? So to adopt industrialization in order to compete with the West. And I think similar things are happening. So for example, with the post-colonial turn, similar things were happening. So we had countries that were becoming independent in a geopolitical environment where competitive economic development kind of secured geopolitical reproduction, right? And so within that context, actors find themselves, especially state actors here, but also, economic actors and classes. But also it doesn't have to, and I think that's the really interesting thing about UCD, and that connects to what Sara was saying, that it's not necessarily only about economic processes, right? But UCD can also, people have applied it to, the uneven and combined development of food, for example, so that also unevenness and combination exists in many aspects of the social world, but I would like to add a point to the question on nationalism as well, because I think what is really important in the context of kind of the more recent kind of return of nationalism is also to keep in mind that I think this nationalism is also in a lot of cases centered around kind of a fossil fueled kind of nationalism or ideology, right? So, and I think that can tell us maybe a little bit about where we're heading, because I think in the context of the climate crisis and growing efforts and global movements, there's going to be, backlashes by the right that are trying to preserve a certain economic order based on the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And I think this is visible today, in different countries, but it's also visible here in Germany, for example, in the narratives of the right. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. To bring back a general question that all of you also mentioned, the question of agency, and especially the question of class. Ingrid, you mentioned in your talk, but that also added some, or linked to some topics of the other talks, that class was a predominant topic in especially in the dependency approach. And you mentioned also that it somehow was treated as the only actor, right? Now we know that there are, of course, many actors more, and class is just one level. But also, hearing your talks, class remains one of the basic and one of perhaps also the most important categories in analyzing these questions, one of the basic analytical category in analyzing today's political struggles and social change. So how to reconnect, or how to connect, or deconnect in a way, different categories and different groups. Do we need to talk about, or re-talk about class, bringing class back in, or focusing on groups belonging and who are the main actors behind that? And so what is your perspective on that? Who wants to bring in his or her view on this question? And then perhaps also we can open up the discussion to the public. Until now, there is no question, but please use the Q&A section in Zoom. Who wants to start?
Someone else can start if you want, because I went first before. I don't mind.
Okay, so then go ahead, Ingrid.
Or I can, yeah, or I can go again. Okay. I mean, I think this is, I also picked up on this point. Actually, I was thinking about it while the others were talking. That is really, I really like this discussion about, because I do think that you're right, that class was like in critical circles, structuralists, Marxists, institutionalist, class was the predominant category, even though of course there were exceptions, and like there were some dependency theories like Kvangraven who did look at gender and race. So there is like, of course there were exceptions, but class was definitely the major issue. And then today, it stands in contrast to today where we have big social movements around Black Lives Matter. It's obvious, everyone can, you know, see that race matters. You know, the whole Me Too movement, like everyone now knows that, well, not everyone, but it's like more or less mainstream that like gender really matters. But because of the exclusion of structuralist thinking or radical thinking in academia and in politics, these issues tend to be treated separately from class. So there's been this division. So now, yeah, gender and race matter, everyone knows, but they're like treated in a very like liberal way. So in that sense, it's about, yeah, exactly reconnecting these issues and like expanding the way we think about class and capitalism to look at how capitalism is racialized, it is gendered, but we can't understand race and gender like separate from the economic structures and the class structures as well, which I think Sara kind of already alluded to, that it's not necessarily about now we need to look at race, it's about looking at class and race or class and gender, all of these things and how they intersect. And that is, I think, an important issue for the new generation, as we're being called, and also I think it links to how like the rise of postcolonial theory and decolonial theory, which is often again kind of disconnected from analysis, structural analysis of capitalism, and they kind of just look a bit more at culture and identity. Not all of them, but many of the ones that kind of reach the top of the IPE journals and stuff. So because I guess that is more palatable to talk about identity without the structural analysis has kind of gone out of the mainstream. So, so therefore it's easier to grab onto like postcolonial or decolonial theory. So I think that's something that definitely structural radical scholars need to take seriously.
Sara.
Can build on that. I very much agree with Ingrid. And I do think that, I mean, to put it in very simple terms, I think that one of the reasons why the categories of gender and race have gone mainstream to some extent is that I think that there is a sense that it's much easier to understand what gender is and what race is than to understand what class is. And I think that this is a completely wrong understanding of all of these categories. And so there is a lot of work that needs to be done in order to bring back gender and race into those radical traditions that have looked at these categories in a deeper way, if you want. So that's one thing. And I would like to add the following, that I've been very inspired by the work of Warnecke-Berger, who essentially talks about the interplay, or in fact the co-constitution of class, race and gender forms of oppression. And so the starting point from that perspective is to go beyond the sort of classification of class as a kind of economic category, gender as a social category, and race as a cultural category, and to recognize how there are some economic, social and cultural aspects in all of the above. And I think my work has been very much informed by this type of thinking. And recently I found myself in a bit of a turning point in that, I think that there is definitely the need to see the co-constitution of these forms of oppression, but at the same time, perhaps there is also a need to recognize that there are elements of difference in how gender, class and race inequalities come about. But I don't have an answer to how to do that. But I think that, yeah, again, this is, again, I think another theme for where more research is certainly going to be very useful, I think.
Thank you.
I think if I could build on that as well, because I think, of course, we should think of class, race and gender, kind of bring the three together, and perhaps also other forms of oppression and inequality. But and I think what can also help us if we kind of want to think about it in, you know, in terms of thinking beyond purely anthropocentric notions. I think what is really interesting here is obviously that this idea of what nature is and who is considered to be part of nature and who is considered to be human has always changed across history, and has of course been like integral to colonial domination and imperialism, and has also and is still kind of shaping the way people are exploited across the world, right? And what is considered to be labor that is remunerated and what isn't. And so just to kind of bring that into the debate as well, it's so I think, yeah, here we really have to kind of bring the three into dialogue.
Thank you very much.
Can I add my 2 cents on class? I'm in total agreement that we need to bring together race, class, gender, and other forms of oppression. I would say 2 things on this topic. One of them is, if you look at the debate on South American countries, on the recent experience of South American countries, what I feel that is very stark in this debate is that class analysis is mostly restricted to the sociological literature, and economists focus mostly on the, say, economic weaknesses of these development strategies. And one of the main goals of my own research is precisely to bring those things together, to think that we have to think about, to suggest that we have to think about the political economy of these recent development experiences, not from, say, a static standpoint of how we see the class configuration, the class structure of these particular societies in one specific point in time, say in the beginning of these experiences, but we have to bring together the pattern of accumulation to see how changing configurations of the labor market, changing configurations of social reproduction in themselves change the class structure, change, of course, class formation experiences, and then class struggle. So we have to bring economics and say more sociological analysis of class together to actually offer a political economy of development that is worthy of its name. The other thing that I would say is that I think it's very clear that the relevance of class analysis has been made very, very clear by the fact that the neoliberal project in the last 4 or 5 decades has been a class project in many senses by the ruling class. And the only way that we can resist it and offer alternatives to this project that is characterized by so much social suffering is by building class power that is able to antagonize this class project. And to build this class power, we have to begin with the understanding, of course, that the working classes have always been gendered and racialized, and that we have to think about this, the process of exploitation and expropriation alongside each other, and to think about the actual experiences of the different segments of the working classes in this different contexts, in ways that we can connect how the pattern of accumulation work to weaken these working classes, to fragment these working classes, and to disrupt its capacity to organize itself, and how we can understand its own struggles of resistance and struggles of becoming a working collective power that can offer some resistance to the project of the ruling classes. So again, class analysis seems to me to be crucial if we think of it along these lines.
Thank you very much, and I think many of us can share this thought. One last issue, 1 minute each. Our last question: if you would have to pinpoint one essential analytical tool, and of course, Fernando, class is one of those issues, but one critical issue that your work adds to the understanding of this pessimistic turn we have described in our introduction, what would it be? 1 minute, one issue each. Ingrid. I just proceed with the names in the panel, so if anybody wants to be first. No? Okay, so please.
It's me again. One tool, it's like the whole talk is about structuralism, which is like the where we have to look at things structurally and holistically. So I don't think it's really easy to have one tool. But I guess in my own work, what I found very helpful and illuminating is to understand. So my work is on like finance in Africa, as you mentioned in the beginning, like Ghana and Senegal. And I think in addition to kind of looking at the structural aspects, anchoring the analysis in historical, like a long durée perspective, has been really crucial. And I think it's, I mean, even in dependency research and like structuralist research, I think, and even Marxist research, I think sometimes that's underemphasized. And I think, like especially in developing countries where the colonial legacies still have an impact on like how all kinds of institutions are shaped. I think that would be my one analytical tool that I am thinking now is very important.
Thank you. Sara.
So if you allow me to qualify social reproduction as a tool, I would go for social reproduction. Adding simply the following, that I think is not only helpful analytically, but also as a site of political struggle. And I think in that sense, the feminist movements in Latin America are teaching us a lot on how to do that. Yeah.
Fernando.
Well, my silver bullet would be, I'm trying to make the case that the concept of styles of development by Aníbal Pinto and the way it's being developed by Furtado and the other early development thinkers is very useful because it allows us to connect the most interesting formulations from, say, Kalecki and Marx and macroeconomics on the one hand with political economy, class analysis, social reproduction framework on the other by bringing pattern of accumulation and class formation together. So my silver bullet will be styles of development.
Thank you. Johanna.
Well, I think for me, as you might guess, it might be multiplicity. So this idea of there being more than one society, which seems so simple, but is actually quite profound, I think, if we think of the idea of development, for example, that if you recognize this multiplicity and if you recognize that it's interactive, it also means that development never really replicates itself, and it's never fully a replica of, you know, one country's development is never a replica of another's. And I think this also connects a little bit to what Professor Kahn said. We have to look at development and historical events and historical processes from different perspectives, right? From within different countries and how they experience this interconnectedness and multiplicity of societies. And so I think it tells us a lot that universal models don't work, and there's also no universal road to development. And I think that also shows that, you know, perhaps in talking about the climate crisis and possible solution to it, it also shows that, you know, it must be simultaneously at the global level, but it also must be at the local level, and the two are fundamentally interconnected and in kind of dialectical relation. So any kind of movement should connect the two levels as well.
Thank you very much. And of course, as time runs out, thank you to all of you. Thank you, Ingrid, Sara, Johanna, and Fernando. And of course, thank you to the first panel, to Hartmut, Luis Carlos, and Mushtaq, for this wonderful discussion and this generational talk. We keep this discussion ongoing with an occasional paper series, so please follow us on our homepage, extractivism.de.